Violet's vengeance, the kitchen slave who served poison in New Orleans in the suffocating heat of a New Orleans summer, when the air itself felt diseased and heavy with rot. An entire bloodline collapsed in a single night. Within the grand walls of a Garden District mansion, members of the Bogard family fell one by one, their bodies betraying in perfect, terrible unison. Official documents would later whisper of sudden illness, of a fever that swept through the household like an invisible storm. Yet buried in the margins of forgotten records and sealed journals was a far more unsettling truth, one that trembled with pain and deliberate design. The physician summoned to the house that night wrote of horrors he could not explain. He described screams that rose together, as if rehearsed, echoing through hallways lined with portraits of smug ancestors. He noted fingers darkening to the color of bruised fruit, tongues swelling and turning an unnatural violet, eyes wide with the realization that death had been invited to supper. There was no known sickness that behaved this way, no plague that struck with such cruel timing. Every collapse came after the same measured span of time, always following the family's sacred Sunday meal, and when dawn finally broke, staining the windows with pale light, only one soul in that house still breathed. Violet, the cook, remained standing in the kitchen, silent and untouched. For generations, the city wrapped this night in silence. Shame and fear sealed mouths shut, and the mansion's doors closed forever. But silence has a way of fermenting, of turning into something poisonous of its own. To understand what happened in that kitchen, one must look far beyond that final meal, into a city where beauty and brutality lived side by side like lovers who despised one another. New Orleans in that era glittered on the surface, a jewel of commerce and culture. Beneath the chandeliers and wrought iron balconies lay suffering so normalized it became invisible. Wealth flowed from sugar fields and cotton rows watered with sweat and blood, and the grand homes of the Garden District stood like temples built on broken backs. The Bogard estate was among the finest, its towering columns reaching upward in arrogant defiance, as though daring heaven to look too closely. The master of that house ruled with absolute certainty that cruelty was his right. His word was law, his temper swift, his punishments inventive. His wife learned early that survival meant silence, and so she perfected the art of not seeing. Their children absorbed this indifference as inheritance, learning that human beings could be owned, commanded, discarded. Extended family filled the rooms with laughter and music, hosting elegant gatherings while suffering labored unseen below their feet. An elderly matriarch watched over it all, her authority sharp despite her age, and a sharp-tongued aunt missed nothing, choosing judgment over mercy at every turn. Within this world existed dozens of enslaved lives, each one ground down by routine cruelty. Yet Violet's burden was singular. Born into servitude within those very walls, she inherited not freedom but responsibility. When her mother collapsed from exhaustion, Violet was still barely grown, yet the kitchen was placed into her hands without ceremony or compassion. From that moment on, fire and blade, spice and bone became the language through which she survived. Violet possessed a gift that bordered on the uncanny. She could coax depth from the humblest ingredients, summon comfort and delight from pots that never rested. Guests praised flavors they could not name, marveling at meals that seemed touched by something divine. They never looked toward the kitchen when they spoke those words. Violet heard them anyway. Praise, she learned, did not soften chains. Her days stretched endlessly, beginning before the sun and ending long after the house slept. Her room offered no refuge, only darkness and a thin mattress that remembered every ache. She owned almost nothing except a small cross once held by her mother, worn smooth by desperate fingers. Hunger was her constant companion. Though she created feasts fit for royalty, she was forbidden to taste them. She learned doneness by scent, seasoning by instinct, sweetness by memory alone. This was not accidental cruelty. It was ritual humiliation, enforced with satisfaction. The master delighted in reminding her of this paradox. He would speak softly, almost kindly, as he explained that her hands existed to serve, never to enjoy. Each word pressed deeper than the last, planting something bitter and enduring inside her. Violet listened. Violet remembered. What no one noticed was how closely she studied the plants delivered to the kitchen, the roots and leaves brought from markets and gardens. What no one questioned was her quiet conversations with elders among the enslaved, exchanges wrapped in folklore and warnings. Knowledge survived where hope could not. Remedies and poisons often shared the same names, differing only in preparation, in patience, in intent. On that final Sunday, the Bogard family gathered as they always had. Candles burned, plates gleamed, laughter drifted through rooms heavy with entitlement. Violet moved through the kitchen like a shadow given form, her face unreadable, her hands steady. Nothing seemed unusual. Nothing ever does right before the end. When the symptoms began, confusion turned quickly to terror. Voices rose, then broke. Bodies fell. The house that had consumed so many lives finally choked on its own excess. Violet did not run. She did not scream. She waited, listening as the echoes faded and silence reclaimed the halls. By morning the mansion was a tomb. Violet stepped outside into the humid light, carrying nothing but herself. History would erase her name, distort her story, hide the truth behind polite lies. But the walls remembered. The kitchen remembered. And somewhere in the lingering scent of spices and smoke, a whispered reckoning remained. This is the kind of truth unearthed by gospel of the haunted, where forgotten voices rise again, and vengeance waits patiently in the dark. The warning signs were always there, hidden in small movements most people never noticed. The way his jaw tightened when he leaned over account books, the sharp pause before his breath returned to normal. Those who lived under his roof learned to study these signals with the devotion of believers reading omens, because survival depended on anticipation. In that house, silence was never empty. It listened. Among the enslaved people, Violet stood apart, elevated and imprisoned by the same role. They regarded her with a complicated mixture of admiration and sorrow. Her mastery of the kitchen granted her a strange protection. She was spared the lash more often than others, never sent into the brutal glare of the cane fields, sometimes handed dresses discarded by women who never once wondered how they reached her hands. Yet that small mercy carried a cost. Her days were consumed by fire and iron, by endless preparation, leaving her cut off from the fleeting laughter, whispered songs, and stolen comfort that allowed others to endure. Respect followed her, but companionship rarely did. Only one dared cross that invisible boundary. Samuel, the stable master's son, moved through the yard with a quiet confidence that drew Violet's gaze despite the danger stitched into such attention. Their eyes met across the courtyard like sparks struck in darkness. Words passed between them late at night, murmured over cooling pots and dying embers, voices low enough to avoid the walls themselves. What grew between them was fragile and forbidden, a secret they cradled like a flame in cupped hands. Samuel spoke sometimes of impossible futures. He imagined freedom purchased with years of labor, land far away where names could be chosen rather than assigned. Violet listened, wanting to believe, knowing how cruel the arithmetic of bondage truly was. Strong bodies translated into profit, dreams into nothing. The stars above the mansion seemed closer than the life he described, yet still they whispered hope into the spaces fear had not fully claimed. Watching all of this from the shadows was Moses, the old butler whose body told a longer story than any ledger. His back curved like a question never answered, his hair pale with decades of obedience. He anticipated desires before they were spoken, appeared and vanished, as if summoned by thought alone. Society praised his devotion, mistaking survival for loyalty. But behind his eyes burned something cold and patient, a fire that had learned to wait. Then there was Lily, barely grown, assigned to serve the women of the house. Beauty clung to her like a curse she could not shed. She moved with careful precision, every gesture measured, every breath controlled, knowing too well how easily notice could become hunger. Fear followed her from room to room, shaping her into something nearly invisible, a ghost polishing mirrors and arranging hair while praying to be overlooked. In the stables labored Thomas, Samuel's father, a man carved hollow by endurance. He had lived through masters and burials alike, learning that grief must be swallowed whole. His understanding of horses mirrored his understanding of people, both requiring calm hands and unreadable faces. Survival, he taught without words, meant never letting truth reach the eyes. The mansion itself pulsed with routine, each day unfolding according to rules etched deep into its bones. Morning meals arrived with mechanical precision, afternoons filled with visitors and murmured deals. Yet above all hovered Sunday supper, the sacred ritual that defined the household. It was the axis around which the week turned, a ceremony treated with near religious reverence. As evening approached, the house transformed. Light gathered in crystal and silver candle, multiplying stars across polished surfaces. The dining table stretched long and imposing, a monument to excess and order. Every plate, every glass, every folded napkin spoke of wealth carefully displayed. For the family, it was a celebration of unity. For Violet, it was the final test of her endurance. Her preparations began days before, moving through markets with a discerning eye, fingers brushing herbs and roots as if greeting old acquaintances. Menus were crafted with reverence and calculation, honoring tradition while showcasing her unmatched skill. Courses unfolded like chapters in a story only she could write, each dish layered with precision, each scent designed to linger in memory. As the appointed hour neared, the family gathered for drinks, laughter spilling easily from mouths that had never learned restraint. Children listened, elders dictated, roles reinforced themselves without question. When the announcement came that supper awaited, they moved as one, a solemn procession toward indulgence. Seats were claimed according to hierarchy, unchanged and unquestioned. Power sat at the head, age and authority close at hand, others arranged like pieces on a board long set. Conversation flowed along safe channels, carefully guided to preserve the illusion of harmony. But beneath polished words, tension simmered, thick and unseen. The year had not been kind. Flooded fields had yielded poor harvests, and debts crept closer with every passing month. Property slipped through grasping fingers, and desperation pressed in from all sides. The unthinkable hovered, the possibility that human lives would once again be sold to balance accounts. These pressures twisted something already cruel into something volatile. Tempers ignited without warning. The enslaved learned to read the air itself, sensing storms before they broke. Silence deepened, steps softened, eyes lowered. Every sound carried risk, and in the kitchen, Violet moved with deliberate calm. She heard everything. She remembered everything. The rhythm of the house beat around her, steady and predictable, like a heart unaware of the blade poised above it. The walls leaned closer, the shadows stretched, and somewhere between preparation and prayer, something irreversible took shape. This is how horror truly begins, not with screams, but with routine, with order, with the quiet certainty that nothing will change. In the world of gospel of the haunted, it is in these moments that fate sharpens its edge, waiting patiently for the final course to be served. The danger was always announced before it arrived, carried in the sharp edge of his voice when commands were issued, and more chilling still, in the way his eyes emptied of warmth when a new cruelty was forming. Those moments froze the air itself, warning anyone watching that pain was about to be chosen deliberately, thoughtfully, without haste. It was during this season of tightening tension, when fear clung to the mansion like damp heat, that Violet's bond with Samuel crossed an invisible boundary and became something impossible to deny. The spark that ignited everything came on a Thursday afternoon in late June, when the Louisiana sun pressed down so heavily it felt as if the city itself was being crushed. Even the walls seemed to sweat. Violet was deep in her work, arranging delicate bites for an upcoming dinner meant to impress visiting plantation owners from Charleston. Every garnish was placed with care, every movement practiced, until a sound from the courtyard shattered the rhythm. Samuel's voice cut through the heat, raised not in anger, but in terror. Violet ran to the window, her breath catching as the scene burned itself into her memory. Samuel was on his knees in the dirt, shirt torn, skin split and bleeding. Standing over him was the master of the house, whip coiled in his fist like a living thing. His face was contorted, rage dripping from every word as accusations flew. He roared about insolence, about forbidden glances, about imagined transgressions that required punishment. The air carried every syllable with brutal clarity. Understanding struck Violet like ice. The master's daughter had been lingering near the stables for weeks, her curiosity reckless, her interest dangerous. Violet had noticed the flushed cheeks, the lingering looks, and Samuel's visible discomfort as he tried to disappear whenever any white woman drew near. He knew too well what such attention could mean, but in the warped logic of that world, a slave's attempt to avoid temptation was twisted into guilt, and guilt was enough to justify death. Samuel tried to speak between blows, his words breaking apart under the lash. He swore innocence, pleaded for mercy, promised nothing had happened. The whip answered him instead, cracking through the air, carving fresh lines of agony across his back. The master declared silence proof enough, his voice thick with satisfaction. Then Violet moved. She did not think, she did not calculate. She burst from the kitchen, her body acting before fear could stop it, throwing herself between the raised arm and Samuel's torn flesh. Her cry tore out of her, raw and desperate, begging for mercy, insisting Samuel was good, loyal, undeserving. The words tumbled over one another until they collapsed into silence. The master turned toward her slowly. What replaced his rage was far worse. It was a cold awareness, a predator's focus. The courtyard seemed to shrink as the other enslaved people melted into the edges, instinctively retreating from what was about to unfold. His voice dropped to a whisper that carried more terror than shouting ever could. He spoke of property, of discipline, of a cook who had forgotten her place. Violet felt her knees tremble, but she did not step aside. She could smell the alcohol on his breath, see the broken veins spidering through his eyes as he leaned close enough to invade her space. He mocked her skill, belittled her worth, questioned how a woman who fed others could believe she had the right to speak. Each word pressed down like a weight, meant to crush her spirit. The courtyard fell silent except for Samuel's ragged breathing and the distant cry of a bird somewhere in the garden, an almost cruel reminder that the world beyond these walls continued on, indifferent. Violet knew, in that suspended moment, that she had crossed into a place from which there was no retreat. And yet, when she looked down at Samuel, broken and bleeding, she found she did not regret it. She spoke again, steadier this time, repeating that he was a good man, that he had done nothing to deserve this. The master laughed, the sound sharp and brittle, like glass shattering. He reminded her that goodness meant nothing here. Ownership was the only truth. He leaned closer, lowering his voice as if sharing a secret, telling her she had grown ideas far beyond her station. The punishment that followed was not content with pain alone. Samuel was dragged away and locked into the tack room, sealed in darkness without food or water, left to learn obedience through deprivation. But the master saved his most inventive cruelty for Violet. Before the household, he announced his decision with theatrical calm. Violet would continue her duties as head cook, preparing every meal as expected, but she would not eat. Not until every member of the family declared satisfaction. And since he himself was notoriously difficult to please, the threat needed no further explanation. It hovered in the air like funeral smoke, thick and suffocating. The days that followed blurred into a waking nightmare. Violet worked without rest, her body weakening as hunger hollowed her out. She survived on water, and the occasional scraps slipped into her hands by Moses or Lily when no one was watching, small acts of rebellion carried out with shaking fingers. Her hands trembled as she kneaded dough, her vision swam as she stirred sauces. Carrying heavy platters became an act of sheer will, her legs threatening to give way with every step. Yet the physical suffering was only part of the torment. The master made a performance of his displeasure. Each meal was criticized, while he savored every bite, describing flavors in detail as Violet stood nearby, forced to watch, forbidden to taste the food born from her own hands. Too salty, too dry, overcooked. Each complaint extended her punishment, each satisfied smile cutting deeper than the whip ever could. In those moments, something inside Violet changed. Hunger stripped away fear. Humiliation sharpened memory. And as she stood there, listening, watching, enduring, she learned something vital. Cruelty thrived on control. But control could be poisoned. This is where the darkness deepened, where suffering ceased to be endured and began to be remembered. In the realm of Gospel of the Haunted, these are the moments that shape fate, when endurance turns inward, ferments, and becomes something far more dangerous than despair. By the second day of her punishment, desperation cracked the fragile boundaries holding the household together. Samuel, weakened but driven by fear for Violet, forced his way out of the locked tack room under cover of chaos and pain. He stumbled through the yard like a wounded animal, blood soaking into the dust, guided only by the need to see her, to know she still lived. He reached the kitchen doorway before he was seized. The men dragged him back with ruthless efficiency, and what followed was not a beating meant to correct, but one designed to break. The blows fell into bone and flesh no longer seemed separate things. It was so severe that a physician was summoned, not out of mercy, but to ensure the body being punished did not die before the lesson was complete. Dr. Tebedo arrived with his bag and his silence, kneeling beside Samuel as the whip marks were cleaned and bound. Blood pooled, breath rattled, and as he worked, the doctor felt eyes on him. Violet stood nearby, her frame reduced by hunger, cheeks hollow, lips cracked. Yet her gaze was sharp, unsettling, alive. There was something in her stare that made his hands hesitate. It was not panic. It was not despair. It was focus. Later that night, he would tell his wife that the cook bore the expression of someone who had been driven beyond the place where pain could frighten her. He had seen it before in those pushed too far, the dangerous ones who did not shatter but hardened. Dr. Tebedo understood cruelty in ways polite society preferred not to acknowledge. He had climbed into respectability through skill and compromise, tending the wealthy while secretly treating those whose suffering was considered expendable. He had witnessed spirits collapse into emptiness, people reduced to shells that moved and breathed without truly living, but there were others, rare and terrifying, who transformed suffering into something deliberate. They learned patience, they learned timing, they learned how to smile while imagining blood. As he watched Violet press cloth to Samuel's wounds with hands that should have been trembling, but were instead steady, purposeful, the doctor recognized the signs. He thought of warning the master, of speaking carefully, of suggesting restraint. Like many thoughts shaped by fear, the warning remained unspoken. Tomorrow would come, he told himself. And tomorrow came too late. By the third day, something within Violet finally went silent, and something else awakened. She stood in the dining room, swaying slightly as hunger hollowed her body, while the master savored a dessert she had once been proud of. He described its sweetness with theatrical pleasure, chewing slowly, forcing her to watch. As he spoke, clarity descended on Violet like a cold mist rolling in from the river, numbing and sharpening all at once. She began to see the household with new eyes. The master's hand trembled faintly when his temper was held in check, a sign of fear he never admitted, a reflection of debts tightening their grip. She noticed the lady of the house lingering too long over her glass, fingers brushing the decanter when she believed herself unseen. She saw the young son's gaze follow Lily with a hunger that made Violet's stomach turn, a familiar danger waiting to repeat itself. More than anything, she began to study patterns. Habits revealed themselves like loose threads begging to be pulled. The old matriarch took her medicine with ritual precision before meals. The master's brother checked his watch compulsively, as if afraid time itself might betray him. The youngest child ate with predictable innocence, saving favorite bites for last. These were details Violet had always known as part of her work, but now they rearranged themselves into something else. The family stopped being masters and became mechanisms. That night, Violet collapsed onto her straw mattress, her body barely responding, her mind perfectly clear. As exhaustion claimed her limbs, a decision settled into place, calm and irreversible. She would continue to serve them. She would obey. She would cook with the same care, the same precision. But her service would no longer sustain them. It would end them. The plan did not explode into her thoughts in a rush of fury. It formed slowly, methodically, like a recipe perfected over years. She understood timing. She understood balance. She understood how small changes, invisible to the untrained eye, could transform nourishment into something final. She would wait. She would choose the moment with care. And when it came, the family would consume the result of their own cruelty. As July arrived in a blaze of heat that seemed to warp reality itself, Violet's exterior returned to what the household expected. She moved quietly. She spoke only when addressed. Her face became a mask of submission, smooth and unreadable. To those who believed suffering always ended in obedience, it appeared the punishment had worked. The rebellious cook was broken, restored to her place beneath their feet, but those who truly watched noticed differences. Old Moses, whose survival depended on ridding people the way sailors read the sky, felt a shift he could not name. Violet's movements were still precise, but the warmth had gone. Where once there had been rhythm and instinct, there was now restraint, intention, control. She no longer hurried, she no longer lingered. Each step seemed measured against an internal clock no one else could see. Lily felt it too, though she could not explain why Violet's presence made the air feel heavier. Samuel, once released but never healed, avoided her eyes. sensing something vast and dangerous moving beneath her calm. The house itself seemed to listen as Violet passed through it, shadows stretching longer, walls absorbing every whisper. This was no longer the story of punishment. This was the quiet birth of retribution. In the world of gospel of the haunted, this is the moment when fate stops waiting and begins to smile, because the meal that would erase an entire bloodline was no longer a possibility. It was being prepared. Something fundamental had shifted inside Violet. Where she once moved through the kitchen guided by instinct and warmth, she now worked with the cold exactness of machinery. Every motion carried purpose. Every pause meant calculation. The gift that had once seemed like intuition sharpened into something unsettling, as if her senses had slipped beyond the natural world. She no longer needed to taste a sauce to know its balance. She no longer waited for bread to brown to know it was done. She listened to heat, to scent, to silence itself, and the food obeyed her. Samuel noticed the change long before anyone else dared to name it. Still healing in the quarters, his body wrapped in pain and fear, he watched Violet during the rare moments she could steal away before dawn. The woman he loved had once carried laughter in her voice, a warmth that softened even the hardest days. The woman who knelt beside him now moved with tenderness, yes, but without softness. When she cleaned his wounds, her hands were gentle, almost reverent, yet her eyes held a stillness that unsettled him deeply. They reminded him of something ancient and patient, something that did not rush because it knew the ending was already written. One morning, unable to contain the dread pressing against his chest, he whispered her name as she prepared to leave. His voice trembled as he told her she frightened him, that something about her felt wrong. She stopped in the doorway, framed by the thin gray light slipping through the narrow window. When she turned, the look she gave him froze his blood. It was calm, it was resolved, it was final. "I'm going to take care of everything," she said softly. "You don't need to worry anymore." He asked what she meant, but the words followed only her shadow. She was gone before he could stop her, leaving behind a certainty that what she planned would not spare anyone, least of all herself. The Bogard family noticed nothing. If anything, they congratulated themselves. The punishment, they believed, had done its work. Their cook had been humbled, reshaped, returned to obedience. What they saw delighted them. The meals grew more exquisite, the presentations more elaborate, the flavors more daring and refined. Each dish felt like a performance crafted solely for their pleasure. They praised Violet openly, never suspecting that perfection itself could be a warning. What they could not see was that Violet's true labor now extended far beyond the kitchen. Her trips to the French market changed subtly. Alongside vegetables and spices, she lingered near stalls tucked into the shadows, places where knowledge passed quietly and without record. She spoke with herb sellers and women whose remedies lived in whispers rather than ledgers. Her questions sounded harmless, curious even, but each one carried weight. She asked about roots that soothed stomachs and leaves that eased pain. She asked how much was too much. She asked how long suffering could wait before revealing itself. New Orleans was a city built on blurred lines. Medicine and magic shared the same breath. African memory, Caribbean ritual, and native knowledge tangled together beneath the surface of polite society. In this world, healing and harm were often separated by nothing more than intention. Violet listened carefully. She remembered everything. She was careful not to return too often, spacing her visits, changing her routes. No one noticed. Slaves moved through the city constantly, invisible by design. Her most valuable lessons came from an elderly woman whose stall sat at the deepest edge of the market. Mama Bridget was ancient in a way that defied counting, her face etched with time, her eyes bright with secrets. Born free before freedom became dangerous, she carried generations of knowledge in her hands. Mama Bridget never questioned Violet's curiosity. Perhaps she recognized the quiet desperation beneath her politeness. Perhaps she understood that knowledge denied becomes a weapon when finally claimed. She showed Violet bark that calmed the stomach when used sparingly but turned vicious when taken too far. She spoke of mushrooms that clouded the mind, herbs that stole breath, roots that confused the heart's rhythm until it forgot its own purpose. Most important of all, she taught Violet about patience, about how the body absorbs, delays, reacts. About timing, about dosage, about how death rarely announces itself immediately. and how the most effective poisons often arrive disguised as illness. Violet absorbed every word, storing it carefully like recipes waiting for the right occasion. Cooking changed for her then. It was no longer only nourishment, it became control. As summer deepened, Violet began testing what she had learned in ways no one could trace. Tiny adjustments, barely measurable. A leaf here, a powder there, enough to observe, not enough to alarm. A servant complained of stomach pain. A guest excused himself early, pale and sweating. Nothing connected, nothing remembered. Violet watched carefully, adjusting, refining. In the kitchen, she worked like a composer rehearsing a final performance. She calculated body sizes, habits, preferences. She matched substances to courses, flavors to tolerances. She planned not chaos, but precision, suffering measured in minutes, silence timed to the second. Those closest to her felt the change most keenly. Old Moses watched her with eyes that had seen too much to be fooled. Lily avoided her gaze, sensing danger she could not name. Samuel lay awake at night, haunted by her words, knowing that whatever was coming could not be stopped. The mansion itself seemed to sense it. The walls listened more closely, shadows lingered longer. The air grew heavy with anticipation, as if the house were holding its breath. This was no longer preparation. This was rehearsal. The meal that would end everything was no longer a thought, no longer a plan. It was inevitable. In the world of Gospel of the Haunted, this is the moment when vengeance becomes inevitable, when knowledge and suffering fuse into purpose. The kitchen was no longer a place of service. It was an altar. And Violet was preparing her final offering. She watched them closely as the days crept forward, studying every breath, every swallowed bite, every subtle change that followed. A trace of one root slipped into a dish, made August rub his stomach and mutter about discomfort. A whisper of another plant left young Philip pale and uneasy after supper. Nothing dramatic, nothing alarming, just enough to teach her how each body listened, how each soul reacted when the wrong thing entered the blood. These quiet trials became her private education, lessons written not in books but in flesh and weakness, knowledge gathered patiently, deliberately, without mercy. The family never suspected her hand. They blamed the heavy air, the suffocating Louisiana heat that pressed down like a living thing. When Celeste clutched her stomach and complained of unease, it was dismissed as summer sickness. Dr. Thibodeau offered a gentle tonic and polite advice, warning her away from indulgent meals during the hottest hours. When little Emily grew strangely tired after eating, her drooping eyes were blamed on the sun, the weather, the fragility of childhood beneath an unforgiving sky. No one thought to look toward the kitchen. No one ever did. While her understanding of poisons deepened, Violet herself began to disappear. The bonds she once held with the others quietly unraveled. She had always stood slightly apart, burdened by responsibility and endless labor, but now even those thin threads of connection were cut. Lily, who once leaned on Violet for comfort and whispered counsel, was met with smiles that never reached the eyes. Moses, who had filled the hollow space left by her mother's death, sensed something slipping away. Their conversations shrank into polite fragments, stripped of warmth, stripped of truth. Even Thomas, hardened by years of survival, felt unease when Violet passed nearby. There was something in her stillness that unsettled him. Not wildness, not anger, control. The kind that reminded him of animals trained to wait, muscles tense beneath calm skin, ready to strike without warning. Only Samuel saw deeper, and even he was kept at a distance. On the rare nights they shared quiet moments behind the quarters, he searched her face for the woman he loved and found instead a wall he could not breach. One evening, under stars blurred by humidity, he spoke the fear aloud. He told her she was changing, that she was becoming someone unfamiliar. For an instant, the mask cracked. Pain surfaced. Rage flickered. A lifetime of theft poured through her eyes. They took everything she whispered. Her voice barely carried. Her mother, her youth, her freedom. And when she dared to care again, when she dared to love, they took that too. She spoke of watching Samuel beaten, reduced to spectacle, of hunger turned into amusement, of cruelty served casually, without consequence. When he reached for her, she pulled away. He begged her not to become like them. Her answer was colder than the night air. She told him she was not becoming them. They destroyed for pleasure. She would destroy because it was necessary. When he asked what she intended to do, she met his gaze with something far worse than fury. peace, a terrifying calm. She told him she would serve them exactly what they deserved, nothing more, nothing less. As summer bled slowly into fall, her preparations neared completion. Every substance had been chosen, every effect measured, every routine memorized until the household moved in predictable patterns, like pieces on a board she controlled. Timing became everything. Precision became ritual. The kitchen transformed fully into something sacred and profane, a place where vengeance simmered patiently. The moment arrived with the announcement of a grand Sunday supper. Late September. A celebration of abundance. Octave declared it a triumph feast, honoring the sugar harvest that had saved the plantation from ruin. Debts erased, credit restored, reputation reclaimed. He promised an evening that would be remembered, his voice swollen with pride. The mansion came alive with preparation. The air cooled just enough to make breathing bearable, and the house buzzed with anticipation. Invitations had been sent to the most powerful names in Louisiana society. Judges, bankers, merchants, clergy. The family doctor himself would attend, blessing both the table and the illusion of safety. Even the mayor accepted, swelling the count to dozens of souls destined to gather beneath one roof. For Violet, it was perfection, a convergence of witnesses, harvest celebration dripping with irony. The kitchen overflowed with ingredients, aromas, laughter from above that never reached her ears. She moved through her tasks with reverence, each motion deliberate, every seasoning measured with care only she understood. No rush, no hesitation, only purpose. Above her, the house prepared for excess. Below, she prepared for reckoning. The supper would bind them together in shared indulgence, unaware that each plate carried judgment disguised as generosity. The altar was set, the offering nearly complete. And in the world of gospel of the haunted, this was the final quiet before everything changed, before the feast became a doorway, before the living learned what it meant to swallow the weight of their sins. The night was coming. The most powerful names in New Orleans would gather beneath one roof, and Violet understood the poetry of that convergence. Wealth, influence, cruelty, and silence would share the same table, unaware they had been assembled as witnesses. This was not merely a supper, it was a stage, vast enough to hold her reckoning. The scale demanded perfection. Courses would flow with seamless timing, flavors rising and falling like a controlled tide, each plate arriving exactly when it should. Her reputation had been built on such precision, and tonight it would carry a far heavier purpose. What made the evening exquisitely complete was Octave's command regarding the household staff. Determined to present flawless service, he ordered every house slave to remain inside the mansion throughout the night, waiting, watching, ready to respond. Violet heard the decree and felt something settle inside her. No one would be absent. No one would escape the moment. Every face that had laughed, looked away, or stood idle during her humiliation would be there when the balance shifted. In the days leading up to the feast, Violet became a force of relentless focus. Even those long accustomed to her excellence felt unsettled by her intensity. At the French market, she moved from stall to stall with a gaze sharper than a blade. She tested ripeness with her fingers, weighed cuts of meat in her hands as if listening for secrets hidden in the flesh, crushed herbs between her palms to judge not only their scent, but their strength. Nothing passed without scrutiny. Nothing was chosen by chance. The menu she designed was a triumph of Creole tradition, a procession of dishes meant to awaken appetite and soften resistance. The opening course would slide across the tongue with deceptive gentleness, warming the body, encouraging hunger. Fish would follow, dressed in sauces that demanded hours of patience and perfect timing. Each preparation was layered, intricate, demanding attention, just as she demanded attention from those who consumed her work. The birds would arrive next, stuffed with a filling rooted in memory and lineage, altered in ways her ancestors would never have imagined. Violet knew exactly how much change a recipe could endure before it became something else entirely. The meats that followed would be rich and heavy, paired with vegetables pulled from the same soil that had swallowed generations of suffering. Bread would be served at the precise moment. Its warmth and texture were irresistible. But it was the final course that mattered most. The dessert was her signature, a dish whispered about in parlors and demanded at every important gathering. Bread pudding layered with sweetness and depth, crowned in pralines, drenched in custard. It carried her mother, as hands, her mother's voice, a legacy refined through years of quiet mastery. No one questioned it. No one ever did. They trusted what had always delighted them. What they could not know was that Violet had been perfecting another recipe entirely, one measured not in taste, but in consequence. A formula refined through observation, patience, and pain. A transformation disguised as tradition. Her final visit to the market came on Friday morning. Mama Bridget greeted her as she always had, with a smile that suggested knowledge too deep for words, yet this time sorrow lingered in her eyes. She wrapped the final herbs slowly, deliberately, and asked Violet if she was certain of the path ahead. Her voice carried the weight of warning, of no return. Violet did not hesitate. She told her she had been pushed too far to turn back, that the road had been chosen for her long before she understood where it led. Mama Bridget nodded and whispered a prayer that sounded less like hope and more like mourning. Mercy, she said, would not be found where Violet was going. That weekend, the kitchen changed. Those who passed by felt it without understanding why. Violet moved as if following a sacred script, each motion exact, each pause intentional. The warmth she once brought to her work vanished. The gentle hum that used to rise from her lips was gone, replaced by a silence that pressed against the walls and lingered in the air. It felt like a chapel built for something dark. Samuel came whenever he could, leaning on pain and stubbornness to reach her. What he saw hollowed him. The woman who once cooked with joy now worked like an instrument, precise and detached. There was beauty in it, but it was the beauty of inevitability, of something already decided. On Saturday night, when the last preparations were set aside and the kitchen lay empty, Samuel approached her as she cleaned her knives. She polished each blade as if removing memory itself, slow and thorough. His voice trembled when he begged her to stop, to choose another path, any path that did not end like this. She did not look at him at first. When she spoke, her words cut deeper than any blade. And another way to what, she asked? Freedom, justice, survival. When she finally raised her eyes, he stepped back without meaning to. What he saw there was not anger. It was clarity. Cold, unwavering, merciless clarity. Justice, she told him, was a story told to people like them so they would wait quietly for nothing. She had waited long enough. The knives gleamed in her hands. Outside, the night held its breath. Sunday was coming, and with it, the moment when silence would finally be answered. Samuel's voice cracked as the truth finally clawed its way out of him. He asked if she truly believed that patience, prayer, obedience, and time would ever summon justice from a world built to deny it. He feared that what she was planning would not simply consume her enemies, but would erase her as well, leaving nothing behind but ashes and regret. Violet listened in silence. Then she lowered the knife from her hand and turned toward him completely, her face stripped of pretense. She told him she had already been erased. The girl he loved had been beaten out of existence piece by piece, spectacle by spectacle. All that remained was a decision. To disappear quietly, or to make sure she was not alone when the darkness closed in. Samuel asked about himself, about them, about whatever fragile future he had still dared to imagine. For a fleeting heartbeat, something human surfaced in Violet's expression. Softness, a memory. It vanished so quickly he questioned whether it had ever been real. When she spoke again, her voice was low and steady. If he loved her, truly loved her, he would find a way to be anywhere but that house the following night. The words landed like a verdict. Samuel stared at her, horror spreading through him as understanding finally settled. He whispered her name as if it were a prayer already too late. She did not answer. She had already turned back to her work. In that moment, he knew the point of no return had passed long ago, beneath a merciless sun, when pain had been made into entertainment and something sacred inside her had been killed beyond resurrection. The morning arrived clear and cool, the first breath of autumn brushing against the city as if to offer relief from months of suffocating heat. The mansion stirred before dawn, every corridor and chamber humming with anticipation. This would be remembered as the gathering of the season, and every servant understood the weight of the day pressing down upon them. Violet rose as she always had, long before light claimed the sky. Yet this awakening carried a gravity unlike any before it. As she tied the crisp white apron and secured her head wrap, she caught her reflection in the broken mirror mounted to the wall. The woman staring back felt unfamiliar. Her cheeks were hollow, her body thinned by hunger and punishment, her eyes holding a stillness that frightened even her. She studied that face carefully, committing it to memory, then turned away without sentiment. That woman would not exist by nightfall. The kitchen erupted into motion as the day unfolded. Pots simmered, knives struck rhythm against wood, flames hissed beneath iron. Violet stood at the center of it all, directing the chaos with absolute control. Unlike other grand occasions, she allowed no one near the most critical preparations. Sauces were made in solitude. Seasonings were blended beneath her sole supervision. Ingredients were guarded as if they were sacred relics. Even she was surprised by the possessiveness that overtook her. It felt instinctive, necessary. Old Moses noticed first, as he moved between rooms, relaying instructions and ensuring the household as smooth operation. He observed Violet pausing whenever footsteps neared the kitchen. Her head would tilt, her hands still, her attention sharpening as if she could sense presence through walls and floors. More than once, he caught her listening toward distant rooms, her focus so intense it bordered on unnatural. He muttered to Lily that something about her felt different, coiled, alert in a way that set his nerves on edge. Lily, exhausted and anxious herself, agreed only vaguely. Violet had not been the same since the punishment. None of them truly understood what that meant. What they could not see was the purpose behind Violet's awareness. This day demanded precision beyond artistry. It required knowledge of who stood where, who moved when, who lingered and who passed through. Months of quiet observation had taught her patterns and habits, but today demanded perfection. Every breath of the house mattered. Every step had to align. As noon passed, the mansion transformed. Flowers filled every space with forced beauty. Glass and silver reflected light until the room seemed to glow from within. The dining table was arranged with an almost obsessive symmetry, fine china resting atop immaculate linen, cutlery aligned as if measured by rule and compass. Everything spoke of wealth, order, and control. Above the stairs, the family prepared themselves for admiration. Hair was styled, garments chosen, jewelry fastened with reverence for lineage and display. The men gathered to drink and boast, congratulating themselves on survival, on success wrested from hardship they had never truly known. Laughter echoed through closed doors. Pride swelled unchecked. The children were dressed like ornaments, instructed carefully on how to behave, how to smile, how to remain silent unless invited to speak. Their innocence was polished and positioned for display, unaware of the weight gathering beneath the floorboards. Below it all, Violet worked. Every motion was deliberate. Every taste, every stir, every measured pause carried intention. She moved through the kitchen like a priestess at an altar, calm and unwavering. Outside, the daylight stretched lazily toward evening. Inside, time bent itself around her will. The house breathed. The table waited, and somewhere deep within the walls of the Bogard mansion, the final answer to suffering prepared itself to be served. The children had been instructed with rigid precision. They were to sit straight, smile when admired, and remain silent unless spoken to, living ornaments arranged for the evening's display. As the afternoon stretched onward, the first carriages rolled into the drive, their wheels crunching against gravel like distant thunder. One by one, the pillars of society arrived, draped in silk and confidence. The judge entered with his wife on his arm, their smiles polished and rehearsed. A banker followed, accompanied by his daughter, whose beauty and fortune clung to her like perfume, drawing glances heavy with calculation. Then came the physician, his medical bag hanging at his side, carried more from habit than expectation, though a faint unease lingered behind his professional calm. When the mayor appeared, laughter swelled, voices rising in admiration, as his presence crowned the gathering with political weight and hollow optimism. Compliments flowed freely. Predictions of prosperity were spoken as if they were divine promises rather than fragile illusions. Yet, beneath the surface celebration, something else was unfolding. While servants scrambled and routines fractured under the pressure of hospitality, Violet moved unseen through the kitchen, executing the most delicate phase of her design. Her focus sharpened into something almost holy. With hands steady as stone, she measured, adjusted, and altered. Each dish received its own quiet alteration, informed by memory and observation. She knew who favored heavy sauces, who ate sparingly, who indulged without restraint. She knew the strength of their bodies, the weakness of their habits, and the order in which they would lift their forks. Nothing was excessive. Nothing was careless. Each addition was small enough to remain invisible, meaningless on its own, yet devastating when united. The true genius lay in her patience. What she had chosen would not strike like lightning. It would creep, intertwine, and awaken slowly, its presence masked by warmth, wine, and indulgence. By the time discomfort blossomed into fear, the source would be beyond reach, and the moment for salvation already lost. As evening settled, the family and their guests gathered in the parlor, glasses raised, voices overlapping in triumph. Octave basked in admiration, his confidence restored, his laughter loud and unguarded. From the threshold of the kitchen, Violet watched them all. Every face carried a memory. Every smile reminded her of a moment when pain had been ignored, justified, or enjoyed. They stood beneath chandeliers and praise, unaware that they had already stepped onto sacred ground. When the call to supper came, it carried the weight of ritual. The procession formed instinctively, hierarchy guiding every step. The master led beside power, followed by elegance and influence, then age and entitlement. The dining room revealed itself like a dream of excess. Candlelight danced across crystal and silver, multiplying itself until the room seemed alive with captured stars. The air was rich with aroma, layered and intoxicating, promising comfort and pleasure beyond restraint. Anticipation tightened the space. Praise for Violet, as talent rippled across the table even before the first dish appeared. Her name passed from mouth to mouth with admiration, though she herself remained unseen, present, felt but not acknowledged. Behind the scenes, she moved without urgency, her expression serene, her attention fixed not on approval but on progression. This was no longer an act of service. It was observation. The first course was served. Bowls were lifted, spoons dipped, and pleasure bloomed across faces like a shared secret. Compliments erupted immediately. The judge spoke of artistry. The banker compared it to distant capitals of culture. Even the most critical among them nodded with rare satisfaction. Violet watched from the shadows, her gaze distant, as if studying the behavior of creatures unaware of the trap closing around them. Beneath the praise, beneath the warmth spreading through their bodies, the opening notes of something far darker had already been swallowed. Course followed course with flawless timing. Each plate left the kitchen as if carried by fate itself. Laughter grew louder. Glasses were refilled. Conversation loosened. Subtle shifts began to ripple through the room, unnoticed and unremarked. A hand pressed briefly against her stomach. A breath caught, then passed. A flush of warmth blamed on wine or candlelight. Violet noted everything. By the time the main courses arrived, indulgence had dulled caution. The room hummed with satisfaction, with fullness, with trust. No one questioned the faint tremor beneath their ease. No one considered that the harmony of flavors was not accidental, that the rhythm of service was not merely skill but calculation. Violet stood at the edge of it all, unseen and untouchable, her role complete and still unfolding. When the final plates were cleared and anticipation turned toward sweetness, the house seemed to hold its breath. The candles burned steadily. The guests leaned back, content and confident. Somewhere deep within the walls, the quiet machinery she had set in motion continued its work, patient and precise. The feast had been accepted, the altar honored. And in the world of gospel of the haunted, this was the moment when indulgence crossed into reckoning, when pleasure became the doorway through which judgment would soon step, silent and unstoppable, into the light. The substances Violet had chosen did not announce themselves with urgency or violence. They slipped quietly into flesh and blood, patient as shadows lengthening at dusk. Each herb, each altered flavor, waited for its companions, allowing the body to accept them as nourishment before revealing their true purpose. By the time the second course arrived, the trap was already closing. The Pompena emerged glistening beneath candlelight, resting in a sauce so carefully balanced it seemed to breathe on the tongue. Applause followed the first bite. The mayor proclaimed it divine, his laughter booming as he demanded the recipe, already imagining the praise it would earn him elsewhere. Octave promised proudly that such treasures would be shared, never once suspecting that the knowledge he coveted was far older and far darker than any kitchen tradition he understood. Wine loosened restraint. Voices grew warmer, stories stretched longer, and the room filled with the easy arrogance of people who believed themselves safe. Toast rose again and again, praising harvests, fortunes, futures. Yet from the doorway Violet watched the undercurrents shift. She saw what no one else was looking for. August still complimented every plate, but his hunger dulled, his fork pausing longer between bites. Celeste smiled through faint discomfort, her fingers pressing briefly to her abdomen before folding politely in her lap. Young Phipe's cheeks flushed with more than excitement, his laughter arriving a second too late. Nothing obvious, nothing alarming. Only whispers beneath the surface. When the meat courses were unveiled, admiration turned theatrical. The beef carried a depth of flavor that silenced conversation. The pork followed, layered and complex, drawing sighs of pleasure from guests who believed themselves connoisseurs of excess. But beneath the praise, bodies were beginning to argue with what they had consumed. It was during this indulgent crescendo that the physician's instincts stirred. His trained gaze drifted from plate to face, from laughter to posture. He noticed the matriarch swallowing with effort, her enjoyment shadowed by something tighter, more strained. He saw perspiration bead along a grandson's brow despite the gentle evening air. He observed the banker's energy falter, his words slowing as if dragged through mud. The signs were faint, easily dismissed in the glow of celebration, and so he dismissed them. For now. Then came the final offering. The bread pudding arrived like an old friend, its scent alone stirring memory and anticipation. The pralines shone, caramelized to perfection, the custard smooth and rich beyond expectation. It was comfort made edible, heritage transformed into art. Praise erupted before forks even touched porcelain. Compliments became extravagant, almost absurd. The mayor swore allegiance to it. The judge spoke of wasted genius. Octave raised his glass, toasting the cook whose hands had delivered triumph to his table. Violet did not hear the words. Or perhaps she did, and they passed through her like wine through a graveyard. The last piece of her work had been set into motion. As dessert plates emptied and coffee steamed, satisfaction settled heavy over the table. Chairs creaked as guests leaned back, hands resting over full bellies, laughter easing into contented murmurs. That was when the shift became impossible to ignore. August's story faltered mid-sentence. His hand rose to his throat, confusion twisting his features as if language itself had betrayed him. Celeste's fan slipped from trembling fingers, the color draining from her skin in a slow, horrifying wash. The physician stood abruptly, concern sharpening into alarm, even as his own stomach tightened in a way that had nothing to do with indulgence. Pain bloomed without warning, spread with unnatural speed, turning warmth into fire, fullness into agony. Breath grew shallow. Sweat soaked silk and linen. Chairs scraped violently as bodies struggled against sensations they could neither name nor escape. The matriarch fell first, her frail form collapsing with a force that shattered crystal, glass exploding across polished wood like frozen rain. Screams followed. Not refined cries, not dignified distress, but raw, animal sounds torn from throats stripped of pretense. The room dissolved into chaos. Some clutched their stomachs, doubling over as if something inside them were clawing its way free. Others gasped for air, hands fluttering uselessly at collars and chests. A burning crept through veins, relentless and unforgiving. The physician moved from person to person, shouting orders that vanished beneath panic, his own vision swimming as the same poison claimed him too. Violet remained unseen. From the shadows beyond the doorway, she watched the collapse of certainty, watched power crumble into terror, watched voices that had once commanded obedience now beg without sound. This was not rage unleashed, it was precision fulfilled. Every moment unfolding exactly as calculated, every symptom arriving on time, in harmony with the others. The candles flickered as if disturbed by an unseen wind. The house groaned, beams settling under the weight of what was happening within its walls. Somewhere, a child cried. Somewhere else, silverware clattered forgotten to the floor. And through it all, Violet felt nothing that resembled triumph, only stillness. In the world of gospel of the haunted, this was the moment when indulgence revealed its true cost, when a celebration became a reckoning written into flesh and breath. The feast had fed more than hunger. It had fed consequence. And the night at last had begun to answer back. Young Amali, as cries pierced the heavy air, her once pristine orandandi dress now damp with sweat and streaked with a darker, more sinister substance. Each sob grew weaker as her small, fast-beating heart processed the toxins with cruel swiftness. Her suffering was brief, but no less excruciating, a merciful brevity in the face of a slow, deliberate retribution. Around her, the grandeur of the Bogard dining room collapsed under the weight of mortal terror. Mayor Shuto, once a figure of political dignity, crawled across the polished floor in a grotesque mimicry of decorum, leaving a trail of bile behind him as his body betrayed him entirely. Every organ seemed to rebel. Every system shut down in a coordinated symphony of pain. Dr. Tibito, whose own hands shook uncontrollably as his vision blurred, moved among them in a futile attempt at aid. His training, formidable though it was, had never encompassed this. A mass poisoning so meticulously designed it struck with simultaneous precision, overwhelming instinct, experience, and hope alike. "Get help," he gasped to old Moses, who remained frozen at the doorway, paralyzed by shock. "Send someone." But even the words faltered, lost to the choking heat of inevitability. Another wave seized him, and in the horrifying clarity of terror, he understood that no rescue would come in time. From the shadows of the kitchen, Violet remained still, her posture statuesque, her face a mask of calm. Yet the tears streaming down her cheeks were not sorrow. They were the release of months of anguish, a pressure long contained, now finding its exhalation in the ruin of those who had stolen everything from her. Samuel stumbled into the kitchen, the shriek of agony from the dining room gnawing at his soul, and froze at the sight of her. His hands trembled, not with illness but with grief. "Violet," he whispered, voice cracking like old timber, "what have you done?" She turned to him slowly, and in that moment a shadow of recognition passed over her eyes. The woman he had loved, but it was fleeting, a ghost of warmth swallowed by steel. The one he had known was gone. In her place stood an instrument forged from suffering, a vessel through which justice, merciless and final, was administered. "I served them exactly what they deserved," she murmured, quiet enough to be lost beneath the lingering groans from the dining room. "Nothing more, nothing less." By the time midnight draped its velvet across the New Orleans sky, the mansion had fallen into a grim silence. Only whispered prayers, hesitant and trembling, escaped from the surviving slaves, while Dr. Tibito scrawled death certificates by candlelight, his pen scratching a futile attempt to order in a world violently unbalanced. How he survived, he would never know. Perhaps the modest portions he had taken, perhaps the years of exposure to medicines, had granted him a fragile immunity. In the official parish records, the cause of death was listed as sudden fever of unknown origin, a lie sanctioned by necessity, a truth too horrifying to acknowledge. The meticulous nature of Violet, as vengeance ensured that even investigation could offer no remedy. Each substance had been natural, each effect subtle, interwoven in a sequence that defeated the primitive science of the era. Organs failed, systems collapsed, and the victims' deaths were indistinguishable from the merciless hand of chance. In whispers, the city came to know the event as the Bogard tragedy, a story that haunted the corridors of power and society alike. The aftermath was a calculus of loss and redistribution. The Bogard estate, emptied of life, was seized by creditors, sold at auction to those indifferent to its haunted history. The enslaved people, survivors of Violet, as wrath and of a cruel system, were scattered across Louisiana. Some, like old Moses and Thomas, were purchased for their skills. Others, like Lily, vanished into the vast, merciless network of human trafficking that fed the plantation. Samuel, sold to a cotton plantation in Mississippi, survived only to meet an accidental or perhaps inevitable end to. Years later, his life a shadow haunted by memory, the trauma of that October night never leaving him. And Violet, she disappeared from all record, swallowed by obscurity, her fate a whispered question. Some say she was sold to a remote parish, fading quietly into an anonymous death. Others suggest she escaped, carrying with her the cold knowledge of justice served, a spectre moving through the shadows of a city that had never known the full measure of her wrath. In the world of gospel of the haunted, the Bogard mansion, as walls absorbed the echoes of screams, the metallic scent of spilled life, and the finality of deliberate vengeance, the feast had delivered more than sustenance, it had delivered consequence. The night answered back, and nothing would ever be the same. Within that darkness, Violet became legend and warning, that the quietest hands can wield the sharpest knives, that patience born from suffering can produce horrors measured with perfect precision, and that sometimes the only justice the living will ever know is the one they are powerless to stop. And so the mansion rested in silence, the ghosts of the guilty and the innocent alike entwined in a stillness that felt almost sacred. Outside, the city continued unaware, but inside, the echoes of what had transpired would linger in the shadows forever. In the kitchens, in the empty dining halls, in the forgotten corners of the estate, her presence remained. A reminder that even in a world bound by law and social order, the scales of justice may be tipped quietly, invisibly, and with a precision more absolute than any human hand could hope to wield. The night had spoken. The feast had ended. And in the cold, unyielding logic of fate, the Bogards had swallowed their due. Whispers and rumors grew like vines over the ruins of memory, each telling of Violet taking a different path into the shadows of history. Some say she vanished into the chaos that followed the revelation of the bodies, slipping northward into the freedom of distant states, or the hidden sanctuaries of Canada. Yet the story most often told in hushed tones among the Creole communities of New Orleans insisted that she never needed to flee. That night, as the mansion burned with grief and silence, she simply walked into the darkness of the French Quarter, becoming one with the shadows, leaving no trace but the legend that haunted the city for generations. According to these tales, Violet survived by transforming the very skill that had once been used for revenge into a means of sustenance and redemption. She fed the city, as poorest, moved through alleys and hidden courtyards under assumed names, a ghost of justice in a world that had shown her none. In kitchens, both grand and modest, she fed those who had never known abundance, using the same hands that had once orchestrated a banquet of reckoning to now nurture life instead of extinguish it. Dr. Tibido carried the secret of that night to his grave, a burden heavier than any medical responsibility he had ever borne. His private journal, discovered by descendants over a century later, revealed his fascination with Violet as precision and cold artistry. He wrote of her not as a killer, but as a woman forged into a weapon by circumstance, a soul stretched to its limits and tempered by suffering. She was not a killer by nature, he confessed, but a woman driven by the impossible choices forced upon her. If blame is to be cast, it must fall upon the system that created such desperation. The Bogard mansion itself seemed to carry Violet's presence long after her departure. When reoccupied in the late 1850s, it became a theater of strange happenings. Guests reported sudden waves of illness during meals. Servants recoiled at unexplainable odors drifting from the kitchen, and cooks swore they glimpsed a young black woman standing by the stove in the pre-dawn hours, watching, waiting. These stories, coupled with the persistent rumors about the Bogard family, mysterious deaths, earned the estate a reputation as one of the most haunted places in New Orleans. Ownership changed hands repeatedly. Few stayed longer than a year before abandoning the mansion, their lives touched by misfortune or fear. During the Civil War, it served as a temporary headquarters for Union troops, later converted into a makeshift hospital. Reports from that time mention patients succumbing to sudden, inexplicable illnesses, feeding the notion that whatever had been unleashed that October evening lingered still, invisible but potent, within the walls. In the 1880s, a historical society attempted to preserve the mansion as a monument to antebellum architecture, but a series of inexplicable accidents thwarted their efforts. By 1894, the building was demolished. Local newspapers noted that the kitchen, the heart of Violet's wrath, remained almost pristine despite decades of neglect, as if some unseen hand had kept it intact. The vacant lot lay dormant for years before becoming a small park. Residents to this day report strange occurrences, sudden sicknesses at gatherings, the lingering aroma of cooking when no kitchens are near, fleeting glimpses of a woman in antebellum dress walking silently in the early morning light. Yet the true legacy of Violet's story is not found in ghost tales, nor in the half-believed whispers of the fearful. It lies in its stark illumination of human cruelty and resilience. The system of slavery that made her suffering possible was built on the presumption that humans could be reduced to property, their pain invisible, their dignity irrelevant. Violet's vengeance reminds us that such assumptions are not only morally corrupt, but dangerously short-sighted. Every structure of oppression carries within it the seeds of its own undoing, and those seeds often germinate in the suffering of those the system seeks to suppress. The Bogard family, the 13 lives extinguished that night, were not monstrous by simple measure. They were products of their time, steeped in customs and beliefs that normalized cruelty. They benefited from a system that demanded the subjugation of others and, in doing so, became instruments of the injustice that would ultimately consume them. Violet's revenge was inevitable, a convergence of human error, systemic cruelty, and a soul pushed past endurance. It was understandable, born of unbearable mistreatment, and yet tragic, because it required the corruption of a spirit that had once known joy in creation and care. The woman who had once measured spices, who had delighted in the crafting of meals meant to sustain and delight, became a force of deliberate destruction, not out of inherent evil, but because the world had left her no alternative path to dignity, no avenue for justice, except through the unflinching execution of retribution. In that transformation lies the essence of Gospel of the Haunted, the horror that grows not from monsters in the shadows, but from choices made in the light of human suffering, from the consequences that inevitably spring from cruelty, patience, and precise intent. Violet's story lingers because it forces us to confront the uncomfortable truth that the greatest horrors are often born of human hands and human decisions. The ordinary, overlooked cruelty of everyday life, when allowed to fester, can become catastrophic. Her legend, whether she escaped into freedom, perished quietly in obscurity, or continued to walk the streets of New Orleans in anonymity, remains a testament to the power of suffering transformed into action. And it reminds us that the scales of justice, though invisible, can be tipped quietly, with perfect precision, by those who have endured too much to remain silent. In the end, the tale of Violet and the Bogard mansion is not merely a story of death or vengeance. It is a meditation on the fragile boundaries between humanity and atrocity, on the inevitability of consequence, and on the way a single person's suffering, when ignored by society, can ripple outward with catastrophic effect. It is a story that continues to echo in the alleys of New Orleans, in the quiet corners of kitchens, and in the lingering scent of meals long past, reminding the living that justice, patient and unrelenting, waits even in the shadows. The true haunt of the Bogard mansion was never a spirit, never a ghost lingering in shadowed halls. It was the weight of human cruelty, the legacy of a society that built its wealth on chains and suffering. Violet's revenge was not magic, not luck, but the cold, deliberate precision of a mind forged by injustice, a mind that transformed pain into methodical retribution. Every whisper, every glance, every carefully prepared dish became part of a tapestry of judgment, unfolding silently until the moment of reckoning. The mansion stood empty, yet its walls carried the memory of calculated vengeance, of lives undone by the cruelty they once inflicted. Justice, exacted not by law but by circumstance, leaves traces that linger in the air, in the quiet kitchens, in the smell of meals that once fed both pride and punishment. In Gospel of the Haunted, we learn that some horrors are human, and they endure far longer than fear itself.